All right, so section 3 of this lecture, I think it's easier if I'm splitting them all up into sections. So section 3, we're actually going to be talking about Indigenous Australians. So it's Aboriginals and Torres Strait Islanders. So when we, you may have a good level of knowledge around what's happening for our Indigenous Australians in relation to their health inequities. But things such as people who are on waiting lists for kidney transplants, and there's an article here that actually talks about people who receive organ transplants at a quarter of the rate of non-Indigenous people. And so that's purely because there are quite a high number of people who are waiting for a transplant, and it needs to be a perfect match. And there's a high level of rejection in organ transplant anyway, so whether it's your brother or sister or who is a genetic match, but waiting for an organ donor is a very difficult and stressing activity to pursue, and knowing that you need to have it because it's going to improve your life and extend your life. So there's an article here that I wanted you guys, it's actually a video, but it's coupled with an article to watch around what's happening for Aboriginal people and them actually accessing organ transplants. So then there's another nice little story here. I'll share the slide with you because I think it's a gorgeous picture of this little girl. And it talks about Aboriginal children and they're in a compass. So this little girl here, we don't know her name, but I think I just loved the way that she was just holding up like a little hand, just in this gorgeous little fashion. I can't do it, but I think there's a discussion on the slide that talks about in this particular child's sort of language, there isn't a word for left or right or front of or behind. So they say rather than telling somebody, say if in school, if they drop their pencil, they'll be, oh, it's down the left of you. They'll actually start, they said that a person who speaks the Guugu Yimithia language would actually refer to things such as the southeast. So they say that they try to teach their children directional cues using the environment or northwest or southeast, southwest. So it helps the children to actually develop an intrinsic understanding, and it improves their memory of their actual location of where they are. So I think that it gives them then it actually goes on to say that it gives them a superhuman sense of direction. So my belief is that Aboriginal people have supreme levels of intelligence, and it's very, very important for us to acknowledge what's happening with their culture and their language, and thinking about that it's not a written culture or a written language, and none of it's ever sort of written down. It's all told verbally from, thousands and thousands of years ago. So I think what's very important for us is to understand that, to get as much of an awareness as possible around that, and constantly educate ourselves on the cultures and the families that we're working with. So there was a woman that I was working with who was coming out of working in Alice Springs, and she said that she was very happy because a lot of the families were complaining about one of the hospitals not allowing their spiritual healers to go into the hospitals with a person who was dying if the Aboriginal person wasn't able to be taken home to die. So they said that the hospital made an agreement that that spiritual healer could come into the hospital along with all of the family members, whoever was wanting to go in there for as long as possible into this particular section of the hospital where this person was. And they said that one small gesture was in itself an amazing sort of transformation of the way that the hospital was respecting the Aboriginal communities in that area. And then that was actually helping people who perhaps otherwise would have had a very long, difficult death, were then able to get a spiritual healing. Their families were able to come in and be with them, and that made such a huge difference to the way that that person's last sort of few months or weeks on Earth were. So if we break down what's happening for the health of our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, we have the normal sort of life course health issues around that children have, as we've discussed before, with our people who are living in rural and remote areas. But historically, we have Aboriginals and Torres Strait Islanders have higher propensity for diabetes or liver disease, kidney disease, and then there is, of course, a higher level of a lower level of literacy within children and teenagers. So the Aboriginal Indigenous Literacy Foundation is sort of there to raise money around getting some supports and some more books into schools. So if you're interested in looking into that. General access to healthcare, which is because of the remoteness, the distances, all of those things, but also to there's quite a big problem with families who are scared to go to a doctor. Maybe that doctor is not an Aboriginal person. They don't understand the culture. They don't understand the family dynamic. They don't understand the way that people talk about health. So that's a very important thing for you guys to understand. It's important for you to think of the structure of the family, the aunties, and the kinship system that happens where you may have a grandparent or a great auntie looking after a number of children for lots and lots of reasons as well. So it's important for you guys to know about that. We talked about children's access to education, which is improving, but it still needs to have a lot more funding put into it as well. And then there is, of course, the large group of people from the stolen generation who have not had access to a parental or grandparent mentor. So that comes with psychological trauma, a level of being displaced, and people not knowing who their family are. They don't know where their country is. They don't know how to get back to their country, to get in touch with their spirituality. So that's very important for you to understand that, although the people that I've worked with in the stolen, who are victims of the stolen generation, are trying to not be defined by that. They are trying to have a level of empowerment and change around what's going on, how moving forward, and their children and their grandchildren, and how they can also be empowered and to have their health improved as well. So the government has created a program called Closing the Gap, and that's actually it started officially sort of last 12 to 18 months. They had a review back here in February this year, and there are 5 priorities that they're actually reviewing with a very serious need for change. So there's the sections are family, children and youth. The health is a very high priority. Education, not just for primary school children, but continuing on that high school trend, and then also helping Aboriginal and Torres Strait Island people have access to university placements as well. Economic development of areas so that it's becoming more sustainable for families and to have the communities to be able to run businesses and to become profitable. And thinking about housing, what's happening for people with housing in that area. And then justice, including youth justice, which we know, as I said earlier, there is a high rate of suicide for our younger Indigenous children. And there is a very high rate of people who are Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander that are actually incarcerated now, who have probably an 80% literacy deficit. So there's a very common link between low levels of literacy and committing crimes and then ending up in the justice system, which is in itself a very poor statistic that needs to be worked on. So it's an incredibly important priority. And then obviously land and land ownership, and then the using water access to fresh water when we are talking about a drought. So mid-2019, COAG have committed to forming a genuine formal partnership with families, Indigenous Australians, and they are attempting to finalise and draft the targets. There's also a National Indigenous Reform Agreement that's being reviewed currently, but it's really coming from a place where the Aboriginal people and the Torres Strait Islander people are leading this reform. So we're hoping that there will be some level of change. There's the review here that talks about shared decision-making and place-based responses and regional decision-making. So it's actually making it a lot more isolated and localised. So isolating means getting it out of Parliament and taking it out to particular isolated areas and having those as hubs. So that's a very important part. Place-based responses and regional decision-making. So that's just making sure that it's culturally responsive and tailored to place. That's very important. Evidence evaluation and accountability. So doing it as an evidence-based practice, which we teach you guys at university, is the best way to go on what's worked in the past, but what's also working in consultation to progress. And also accountability. So making sure that there is a lot of follow-up, that there's a lot of monitoring, and that there will be systems put in place in order to review and revise to improve. And then obviously there needs to be collaboration between governments, communities and other stakeholders when we look at integrated systems for transparency and accountability. So then there is a video here that I wanted you guys to watch on closing the gap. Basically it's a video on National Close the Gap Day, which highlights a couple of people in there that are talking about what happened for them as children, how they were treated differently, how they just were. One particular woman that we've got the photograph here, she was told from a very young age that she wasn't very smart, that she'd never amount to anything, that what was the point? She just sort of turned up to school and she really didn't have to try. These are her teachers actually saying this to her. She didn't need to try very hard. She was an Aboriginal girl, so it really, there's lots of negative things that I'll leave you guys to watch. But I think it's important if you get a chance. It's only 8 minutes, so I'm sure you'll have time to watch that. And then I'd like you to perhaps write up a commentary on your discussion. Having a think of the commonalities with these three populations, there's a good quote here from John F. Kennedy that says, our most basic common link is that we all inhabit this planet. We all breathe the same air. We all cherish our children's future, and we are all immortal. John F. Kennedy, this was 40 years ago that he said this. So I think it's important for us to think about what are the commonalities. We've talked about them in summation. We've talked about access to services. We have limited access to services. We have distances. We have problems with general practitioners coming out to particular areas. We have the economy that's changing, climate change that's affecting rural and remote areas with agricultural production, growing herbs, food for people. We have issues with plants that aren't being nourished appropriately. So there are, as I said, droughts, floods, winds that have always been there, but the drought seems to be severely affected by climate change. Service inequity. There are a number of towns out in Australia that have maybe 6 or 8 psychologists, and then 100 kilometres down the road there is a town without any psychologists that would service maybe the equivalent amount of people, being about 10,000 people. So those people in the town that don't have any psychologists would then have to move or travel 100 k's to go and visit their psychologist. If you're not feeling well, if you're feeling depressed, if you're suicidal, that's a long way to have to travel, and then have to possibly go on a waiting list or go and sit in a waiting room that you may see people that you know. So these are common problems. And the other thing that we think about is, do the health workers understand particular communities? Do they understand farming? Do they understand people who are refugees? Do they understand people who are Aboriginal, Torres Strait Islanders, or do they have a poor attitude to that? So it's very important for us to think about, A, generic health issues across the lifespan, B, what's happening for that particular person on that particular day as a human being, not just a group or a refugee, an Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander, a farmer. Let's put that person into an individualised category of that individual human being and think about what's happening for them in the first place. Ask them the question, what's brought you here today? You know, how can I help you? Those types of questions are very helpful for people. One thing that I wanted to mention as well, talking about discussions around placement of GPs. We have 41% of all people, all medical practitioners that were employed in rural and remote Australia, 41% of those employed were overseas trained registered health professionals. So when I make the statement earlier about, do the doctors understand people in relation to their culture, their history, what makes them tick? Let's hope that they do, but it's important for us as health workers to understand that maybe they don't. And that could be why people aren't going to visit them. Maybe they do and they're possibly absolutely fantastic. And they've done a lot of study in who lives in that area, and they've committed to living in the area, but most of the time the doctors are there for 3 months or 1 year, and then they move out because they may not like living in a rural and remote area as well. Or perhaps they have a child who needs access or better access to health. So for themselves as well as a professional, they've chosen to move out. So that is a difficult problem, The other things we need to think about that are commonalities are culture. Everybody would be from different cultures. There are farmers with different cultures. There are refugees that have different cultures. There are Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders that have different cultures. And they all also have different education levels as well, and different access to education, different values placed on education. So there are some of the similar things as well. One thing we wanted you guys to do was to have in your online discussion, we would like you to think, are there any gaps in services that you know of or have experienced either yourself or maybe people in your family or any of your friends? So have a think about that. Talk to your parents, talk to your grandparents, your aunties, your doctor. Ask them these questions. Do you know of any gaps in services? I'd like you to think about people on waiting lists, people, if you know somebody who's been waiting for a hip replacement for 12 months, or somebody who has a hearing aid that can't afford to pay for new batteries. Only certain people can actually get free batteries from the Australian government for the hearing aids. Otherwise, they cost a lot of money. So you can look that up. Also, which health professionals will play a key role in meeting the needs of these groups? We'd like you guys to put that down in your discussion as well. And then lastly, how can we best manage the challenges of delivering appropriate services to people from such different cultures and health needs? So I'd like you guys to brainstorm that and think about that as well, and post your responses in your online discussions. My last couple of slides here, I've put in a few reports. So General Practice Health of the Nation 2018. So that would be useful for you guys to have a look at for any of your assignments there as well. And then I added in my references, and my last screen share that I'll give to you is this funny little guy. I like him a lot. I would like to wish you guys well. I would enjoy looking at the videos that I've added. I hope you've enjoyed your time today. I've certainly enjoyed talking to you guys. I like this little guy. He just looks really happy. He's sitting there on the lily pad, all relaxed, full belly. He's just had a big fat dose of probably flies or some sort of an insect. He's just happy. He's just sitting there rubbing his belly. And I think that you guys, it's important to look after yourselves, stay motivated, try to switch off any of your electronic devices and just relax and just think about this guy. So I think that in closing, that's my sort of final remark. Thank you for listening to me today, and we'll catch up again.